She spent 24 years learning to disappear. One shattered glass in the wrong room changed everything. A terrified maid on her knees, bleeding from broken crystal, while one of America's most feared crime lords watched her beg forgiveness for existing. He didn't see a servant. He saw the scars, burn marks, crooked fingers, a body that had been used as a punching bag for decades. And for the first time in years, Adrian Dragomir felt something he almost didn't recognize. Rage, cold, deliberate, and aimed at whoever had done this to her. If you want to know what happens when a broken girl and a ruthless man decide the world owes them nothing more, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The wine glass didn't just fall, it detonated. One moment, Elena Ashcroft was moving through the dining room the way she always moved. Shoulders pulled in, chin down, each step calculated to occupy as little space as possible. And the next, her cart clipped the edge of the console table, and a crystal wine glass worth more than her monthly wages launched itself off the edge and exploded across the marble floor in a sound like a gunshot. Time stopped, or at least Elena's lungs stopped. Her heart did something complicated behind her ribs. Not a beat, more like a collapse. And before the last shard had finished skidding across the floor, she was already dropping. Both knees hit marble. Both hands were already moving, scooping glass, bare palms scraping across the floor, and she didn't register the cut until she saw the smear of red trailing behind her right hand like a signature. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll replace it. I'll pay for it, please." She was cleaning faster than she was thinking. That was the trained response. Years of it. Muscle memory deeper than bone. Clean the mess before anyone sees it. Clean it before punishment arrives. Keep your head down and your voice small, and maybe, whoever was watching would decide you weren't worth the energy it took to hurt. There were 7 people in the dining room. 6 of them didn't look at her. The 7th was Adrian Dragomir. He was sitting at the head of the table the way men like him always sat. Not relaxed exactly, but occupying the space with a kind of gravitational certainty, like the chair had been built around him rather than the other way around. He was 41, lean in the way that suggested the kind of body kept functional through discipline rather than vanity, dark-suited, with a face that had been arranged by genetics and violence into something that read as handsome only after you'd already decided he wasn't a threat. The deciding wrong part was where most people got into trouble. He hadn't looked away from his phone when the glass broke. He looked away from his phone now. Not at the broken glass. At her hands. Elena didn't notice. She was still scraping glass off marble, her breath coming in short, controlled pulls through her nose, the kind of breathing you learned when crying was expensive. The cut on her palm was deeper than she'd processed yet. Blood was getting into the pile of glass shards she was collecting with her bare hands, mixing with the crystal dust, and she was still whispering apologies into the floor like a prayer to no one. Stop. The word wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Adrian Dragomir's voice was the kind that filled a room through weight rather than volume, and the single syllable landed on Elena like a hand pressed flat against her chest. She stopped. Every muscle locked. The fragment of glass she'd been holding dropped from her fingers. Slow footsteps across marble. She tracked them by sound. The specific cadence of expensive leather soles, unhurried, deliberate. And she kept her eyes on the floor and waited for the verdict. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't make them stop. They always shook when there were footsteps coming toward her. He crouched down in front of her. That surprised her enough that she looked up. Most men in his position would have stood over her. Standing over her was the efficient choice. Establish height, establish authority, deliver judgment from a position that made clear you were the ceiling and she was the floor. Adrian Dragomir crouched down so they were level, his elbows resting on his knees, and he looked at her hands. Just her hands. Not her face. Her hands. She became aware of them the way you become suddenly aware of a wound the moment someone else notices it. The burn marks across the inside of her right wrist, old and silvered now, the kind you got from a stove element held against skin for long enough to teach a lesson. The crooked line of her left index finger where it had healed wrong after a break that had never been set. The fresh cut from the glass leaking quietly across her palm. The dry, overworked skin of someone who'd spent years cleaning other people's houses. Adrian looked at all of it for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked up at her face, and Elena felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have language for, because the expression on his face wasn't anger, it wasn't contempt, it wasn't the particular flavor of irritation she was used to, the one that preceded consequences. It was something worse, somehow, something she was completely unprepared to navigate. He looked furious, but not at her. "Who did this to your hands?" he said. It wasn't a question. Elena's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The dining room had gone very quiet. The other 6 people at the table had suddenly discovered urgent reasons to look at the ceiling, their plates, anywhere but the floor where their employer was crouching in front of a bleeding housemaid. "The glass, sir. I'll replace it. I'll take it from my—" "I'm not asking about the glass." His voice was patient in the way that suggested the patience was extremely finite. "The burn marks, the finger, the other scars." He paused. "Who?" She looked back down at her hands. The blood from the cut had started to pool in the crease of her palm. "It's nothing," she said. "Old injuries. Please, sir, the glass." "Marcus." He said his name without raising his voice or turning his head, and from somewhere behind Elena a man materialized with a first aid kit. She hadn't heard him move. She wasn't sure when he'd come in. Men like the ones who surrounded Adrian Dragomir moved like weather. You didn't notice them until they were already on top of you. "I can do it myself," Elena said quickly. She was already pulling her hands back. "I know you can." Adrian stood. He was taller than she'd registered from the floor. "You've been doing everything yourself for a long time." He looked down at her with that unreadable expression, and then he said, "Take care of the cut. Then come find me. Don't take too long." He walked back to the head of the table. Conversation resumed like someone had pressed a button. The broken glass was cleaned up by someone else. And Elena sat on the edge of a chair in the hallway, outside the dining room, while Marcus, who had the hands of a man who had broken other people's hands professionally, and the careful manner of someone who had decided to retire from that specific career, cleaned and bandaged her palm without comment. She spent the next 20 minutes trying to figure out why the most dangerous man in the house was the only one who'd asked. Elena Ashcroft had come to work at the Dragomir estate 8 months ago under circumstances that, if you were being precise about it, did not constitute a choice. Gregory and Vanessa Ashcroft, her legal guardians, the couple whose name she carried like a sentence, had placed her there. That was the word they used. Placed, as though she were a piece of furniture being stored somewhere convenient. Vanessa had explained it in the brittle social voice she used for things she'd already decided and wanted to sound generous about. A friend needed a reliable house employee. Elena needed structure. Everyone benefited. Gregory had said nothing. Gregory communicated primarily through silences of varying temperatures, and this one had been the kind that meant the conversation was over. Elena had packed her one bag and gotten into the car that came for her, and had not cried, because she'd learned at approximately age 9 that crying cost more than it returned. What she understood about Adrian Dragomir before she arrived was exactly what everyone understood. That his name appeared in newspapers, mostly in connection with federal investigations, that never quite resulted in charges. That he had made a fortune through a web of legitimate businesses that the legitimate business community found both useful and uncomfortable, and that the previous 3 employees who had worked at this level of proximity to him had left either voluntarily or involuntarily, depending on which version of events you believed. What she discovered after arriving was harder to categorize. The estate ran on a specific kind of order, not the performative order of the Ashcroft household, where everything gleamed and nothing was real, but something functional and efficient, like a machine assembled by someone who cared more about whether it worked than whether it looked impressive. The staff was small. Everyone knew their job. Nobody yelled, which Elena had needed several weeks to stop bracing for. Adrian Dragomir moved through his own house like a man with permanent business elsewhere. Present in the sense that the weather was present, influential, occasionally disruptive, not something you interacted with directly unless you had to. He had looked at Elena exactly twice in the 8 months before the broken glass. Once when she'd been introduced, and once 3 months in when he'd found her reorganizing the kitchen supply room at 2 in the morning because she couldn't sleep and didn't know how to exist in a space without making herself useful. He'd stood in the doorway for a moment, evaluated whatever he was seeing, said nothing, and gone back to bed. She had not been able to interpret that either. She found him in the study, which she'd learned early was the room he actually worked in, as opposed to the office, which was for meetings. He was standing at the window with a glass of something that wasn't a social drink, looking at the grounds, and he didn't turn around when she knocked on the open door, but he said, "Come in." So she did. "Close it." She closed the door. The study felt different with the door closed, smaller, more like something that belonged to him specifically. "How's the hand?" "Fine, thank you." She stood near the door, not because she'd been told to, but because it felt correct. "I can pay for the glass out of my salary. I'd prefer to." "Why?" She blinked. "Because I broke it." "You broke a glass." He turned from the window. In the study light, he looked older than he had at the table, or maybe more himself. The lines of his face more visible. The quality of attention he turned on her somehow more direct. "Do the people you come from send you bills for broken glasses?" It was a strange sentence. Elena spent a moment parsing it. "They send me other things," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. He studied her. "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." "I didn't ask if you were fine. Sit down." He said it the same way he'd said stop, not loud, just absolute, and she sat in the chair nearest the door because her legs made the decision before her pride could object. He pulled his own chair out from behind the desk and sat facing her rather than behind the desk, which was another thing she hadn't expected. "You've worked here for 8 months, he said. "Yes." "You come from the Ashcroft house." "I was employed there, yes." She kept her voice level. There was a specific muscle in her chest she'd learned to keep flexed around conversations about the Ashcrofts. Not tensing, exactly, more like bracing, the way you'd brace a door. "Gregory and Vanessa Ashcroft." "Yes." "The foundation people." "Yes." She watched his face. "You know them." "I know of them." Something moved behind his eyes, a categorization happening, a file being opened. "Everyone with money in this city knows of them. The foundation throws good parties," he paused. "You have burn marks on your wrist that look approximately 15 years old. Your left index finger healed wrong from a break that was never set. I can count at least 3 other old injuries visible on your hands alone." Elena's chest went very still. "That's quite a list. I have a good eye for damage." He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with something. "Are those injuries from your time with the Ashcrofts?" She looked at her bandaged hand. The question was not complicated. The answer was simple. The space between the question and the answer was where everything that had ever happened to her was living. And the idea of opening that space in front of this man, in this room, with the door closed. "I don't think this is something you need to know," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. He leaned back in his chair. "Tell me anyway." She looked at him. He looked back. There was something unnerving about the quality of his attention. Not intrusive, exactly, but complete. The way a surgeon's attention was complete, like he was identifying something rather than simply seeing it. "They weren't kind," she said finally. The words came out flat and insufficient, the way words always were for the specific realities they were supposed to describe. "They haven't been kind for a long time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have they been using you to work in other people's houses?" The precision of the question landed like a key in a lock. She looked at him. "Since I was 16. Before that there were other arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that aren't work." She held his gaze. "The foundation runs programs for at-risk youth. They have a great deal of experience managing what at-risk youth are worth." Adrian Dragomir was very still. The stillness of him was different from other men's stillness. It wasn't frozen, it was controlled, the way a current was controlled, force running underneath the surface rather than showing. "You're telling me the Ashcroft Foundation is using children. I'm telling you I am one of the children they used." She could hear her own voice from a distance, strange and even and precise, the voice she'd taught herself for situations that required the truth to be delivered without the weight of feeling that lived behind it. "I don't know what else they've done. I know what they did to me." He stood up. Not fast, deliberate, like every movement, but there was something in the way he stood that changed the temperature of the room. He walked to the window again and stood with his back to her for long enough that she'd started to wonder if she should leave. "You're not going back there," he said. She blinked. "I live—" "You don't live there. You're housed there." He turned. His expression was controlled the way his stillness was controlled. There's a difference. You'll stay here. You'll be paid correctly, which I suspect you haven't been. If you need anything, Marcus handles that. Elena stared at him. You can't just... I can. He said it simply. Whether I should is a different question, and I'm aware of that. But you're not going back to that house. She stood up. You don't know me. You don't know anything about what happened or what... I know what I saw in your hands. He said it quietly. That's enough. The thing about Adrian Dragomir that she couldn't have explained to anyone, the thing that she was slowly understanding in the 42 minutes since the glass had broken, was that he was dangerous in a very specific way that had nothing to do with the federal investigations or the business empire or the men who stood in the corners of rooms. He was dangerous the way honesty was dangerous, blunt, direct, uninterested in making things comfortable, and Elena had spent her entire life inside a house built on the opposite of that, and something in her chest was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. She sat back down. All right, she said. Abba. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the room she'd been using for 8 months and looked at the ceiling and tried to arrange what had happened into something that made sense. She'd told him. She'd told a man she barely knew the approximate shape of 24 years of what had been done to her. Not the details. The details lived in a part of her she kept locked because she had learned that the details made other people uncomfortable in a way that inevitably became her problem. But enough. More than she'd told anyone. The first time she'd told someone had been social services, when she was 11. The social worker had been professional and kind in the careful manner of someone with too many cases and not enough hours. The Ashcrofts had been professional and kind in the manner of people who had known the social worker was coming and had prepared accordingly. The Foundation's public reputation was immaculate. Charitable donors, community leaders, their name on 3 hospital wings. The investigation had lasted 6 weeks and concluded with a notation that the child appeared well-adjusted and no concerns were flagged. Gregory had explained to Elena afterward, in the cold, measured voice he reserved for lessons, what happened to children who told stories. She had not told stories since. Until tonight. In a study with the door closed and a man whose face she still couldn't entirely read, sitting in a chair that was worth more than her yearly earnings, holding a bandaged hand and listening to herself deliver the approximate shape of her own destruction like it was someone else's history. She put her arm over her face in the dark and tried to figure out what she'd done. The answer arrived around 3 in the morning in the form of footsteps in the corridor, not toward her room, moving past. And she recognized Adrian's specific cadence and lay very still until they were gone. He didn't sleep, apparently, or not much. She'd noticed it before but hadn't thought much about it. Now she thought about it. About a man who ran an organization built on controlled violence and sat at the head of tables in rooms full of quiet, dangerous men, and apparently spent his nights walking his own corridors. She'd told him. He'd said she wasn't going back. He hadn't asked what she wanted in exchange. She'd been trying to figure out the cost since the moment he said it, because there was always a cost, because that was the only world she'd ever lived in. Exchange and debt, and the permanent ledger of what you owed versus what had been done to you. And she couldn't locate one, and that scared her more than the ones she could see. At 5 o'clock, she gave up on sleep and got up and went to make coffee, because making herself useful was the only way she knew to make the inside of her chest quiet. Marcus was already in the kitchen. He looked at her without surprise, which suggested he was the kind of man who was surprised by very little. He was drinking black coffee and reading something on a tablet, and he shifted his mug 1 inch to indicate there was room at the counter without using words, which she appreciated. She made coffee. She stood at the counter. The kitchen was quiet in the way houses were quiet at 5 in the morning. The particular silence of a space holding its breath before the day began. "You're not going back," Marcus said, without looking up. "He told you." "He doesn't have to tell me things for me to know them." He turned a page. "It's not a threat. It's just how things work here." "How do things work here?" she said. He looked up then. He was a large man, the kind of large that came from a different life and had been maintained out of habit, with a face that had accumulated a lot of weather. "He makes decisions," Marcus said. "Then he handles them. He doesn't make a lot of decisions about people, but the ones he makes, he handles." Elena thought about that. That's meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate. He went back to his tablet. The reassuring version is that you'll be safe here. The accurate version is that when he decided to look into your situation, he had already started looking into your situation before you sat down in that study. She set down her coffee cup. What does that mean? It means the phone call started about 10 minutes after dinner. He turned another page. He has people whose job it is to find things. They're good at their job. Elena looked at the side of his face and thought about what finding things about her situation would actually mean. Thought about what was findable. The records that existed, the ones that had been managed and shaped by people who were very good at managing and shaping records, and the ones that couldn't be managed as easily, the Foundation's financial structures, the specific arrangements Gregory had made with specific people over specific years. He won't find anything through normal channels, she said. They're very good at normal channels. He doesn't generally use normal channels. Marcus finally looked up again. You should probably eat something. You didn't eat at dinner. She hadn't. She'd been too afraid of the glass. She ate something. The sun came up. The house woke around her, and she moved through her morning tasks with the muscle memory that had always been more reliable than thought. And she was replacing linens in the east corridor when Marcus appeared at the end of the hall and said, quietly, "He needs you in the study again." There were two men she hadn't seen before. They were sitting when she came in, mid-30s, both of them, with the specific quality of stillness that she'd come to associate with people who worked for Adrian in capacities that didn't appear on organizational charts. One had a laptop. One had a folder, physical, the kind people still used when they didn't want things to be easily traceable. Adrian was standing. He looked like he'd slept about as much as she had, which was to say, not much. "Sit down, Disum," he said. And then before she could decide whether to argue about it again, "Please." The please was new. She sat. He looked at the man with the folder. The man opened the folder and laid 3 photographs on the desk in front of Elena. The photographs were financial documents. She could tell from the format, account numbers, transfer records, the specific dense formatting of offshore banking paperwork. She was not a financial expert. She'd had no education to speak of, formal or otherwise, by the deliberate design of 2 people who understood that education was a form of power. But she could read numbers, and she could see, even without understanding the full architecture of what she was looking at, that the numbers were large. The Ashcroft Children's Foundation, Adrian said, received approximately $12 million last year from sources that do not appear anywhere in their public filings. Elena looked at the photographs, then at him. "How did you?" 11 hours. He said it without pride, just fact. "My people are thorough." He sat on the edge of the desk. "What do you know about the Foundation's actual operations? What I lived through? What I saw?" She looked at the financial documents again. "I was never in a position to see the money side. They kept me useful, not informed." What did useful mean? She thought about how to answer that, about the specific texture of what useful had meant across 24 years. The work, cleaning, cooking, managing households, that had been the visible layer of it, the thing anyone looking at her situation would see. And underneath that, the other useful, the one that didn't have paperwork. The arrangements that happened around the margins of the Foundation's charity events, where people with money and very specific requirements moved through specific spaces, and the children in those spaces were not there because anyone was helping them. She told him. Not all of it. Not the parts that lived in the locked room, but enough. More than enough. The room was very quiet while she talked. When she finished, Adrian hadn't moved. The 2 men had stopped what they were doing. Nobody was looking at their laptops or their folders. "I need to know," Elena said into the quiet, "whether this goes anywhere. Whether you tell me things and then it—" She stopped, started again. "I have tried before. To tell people. It didn't end well. I know it didn't." He reached across the desk and slid a piece of paper toward her. It was a list of names. She recognized 3 of them from social services, from the investigation when she was 11. The social worker who handled your case in 2011 received a consulting fee from one of the Foundation's subsidiary organizations 6 weeks after the investigation closed. Elena looked at the paper. Her hand on the page was very steady, which surprised her. "You found that in 11 hours. My people are thorough," he said again. "What's in the records about you is heavily managed. What's in the money is harder to manage. He paused. I want to keep going. I want to pull this entire thing apart from the financial structure outward. But I need to ask you first, because it's your life and your history, and what happens next affects you more than anyone else. She looked up from the paper. I'm asking, he said, not telling. There was a long silence. In the silence, she could hear from outside the sound of the grounds being maintained. Somewhere distant, machinery, ordinary life continuing at its ordinary pace. In here there were 3 men and a folder full of documents that described the scaffolding of everything that had been done to her. Do it, she said. Pull it apart. Adrian nodded. He said something to the 2 men in a language she didn't speak, and both of them moved with the efficiency of people who had been waiting for that specific word, and Elena sat in the chair by the door and watched the beginning of something she had spent 24 years unable to imagine. The unraveling. So, what she didn't know, in that room, was that someone else was watching. 3 miles from the Dragomir estate, in the back seat of a black car parked on a quiet street, a phone buzzed. The woman who picked it up read 2 lines of a message, and her expression did not change because it was the expression of someone for whom news had long ago stopped being surprising and had become instead simply operational. Vanessa Ashcroft put the phone down. She looked out the window at the quiet street. She picked the phone back up and dialed. Gregory answered on the second ring. He's already looking, Vanessa said. The investigator says it started last night. Gregory was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the temperature she'd always associated with him making decisions. How much does the girl know? Enough. Does Dragomir know she knows? Based on what Harmon just sent me? Yes. Another silence. Longer. Then we need her back. She's inside his estate. I'm aware of where she is, Vanessa. His voice had gone colder. I'm also aware that estates have vulnerabilities. Everything has vulnerabilities. He paused. We've been building this for 30 years. I'm not losing it to a frightened girl and a crime boss who's decided to play rescuer. He's not playing, Vanessa said. No, he isn't. Gregory sounded almost approving, the way he sometimes did when he was categorizing an enemy. Make the calls. I want the PR team ready to move by tomorrow morning. If Dragomir is looking at our finances, we need to control the story before he has enough to do anything with it. And the girl. Get her back. His voice was the temperature it always was when the decision was already made. Whatever it takes. The call ended. Vanessa sat in the back of the car for another moment, looking at the quiet street, and then she put the phone away and told the driver to move. Behind her, on the phone she'd set down, a notification arrived. A news alert. A story. Already drafted, already queued, ready to publish at a word. The headline read, Criminal Kingpin Holds Vulnerable Young Woman Against Her Will. Foundation Fears for Safety of Missing Employee. The story had photographs, sources, a carefully assembled timeline. It had the name of a federal investigator who had already been briefed. It had everything necessary to make a frightened girl into a liability and a mafia boss into a monster. It was ready to go the moment Gregory said the word. In the estate 3 miles away, Elena Ashcroft sat in a study with 3 men and a folder full of evidence, unaware that the people who had shaped every day of her life were already deciding how to end this one. The documents in front of her were the beginning of something. But somewhere in the machinery of what Gregory Ashcroft had built over 30 years, something else was already beginning, and it was moving faster. The story published at 6:47 in the morning. Elena found out the way she found out most things that happened to her, after the fact, when the damage was already structural. She was in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a second cup of coffee she didn't particularly want but needed to do something with, when Marcus came through the door moving faster than she'd seen him move before. He set his tablet on the counter in front of her without a word and stepped back. She read the headline, then the subheadline, then the first 3 paragraphs, which were very well written in the specific way that lies were well written when they had been prepared by professionals. Smooth, concerned in tone, loaded with phrases like sources close to the foundation and growing fears for the young woman's welfare, and the particular construction reportedly being held, which was doing enormous work in a very small space. There was a photograph of her. It was from 4 years ago, taken at one of the foundation's charity events. She was in the background, slightly blurred, and whoever had prepared the story had cropped and enhanced it to make her look frightened, which wasn't difficult because she had been frightened, though not of the thing the caption implied. The caption said, Elena Ashcroft, 24, believed to be in the custody of organized crime figure Adrian Dragomir. She set the tablet down very carefully. How many outlets? She said. 7 so far. Marcus poured himself coffee with the deliberateness of a man who had decided that the morning required it. National. The Wire picked it up around 6. It'll be on television by 8. She looked at her hands on the counter. The bandage on her right palm was white and clean and very small against everything else. They had this ready, she said. This was already written. Yes. They knew I'd said something. Marcus didn't answer that, which was its own answer. She heard Adrian's footsteps in the corridor before the door opened. She'd already learned the specific weight and rhythm of them, a fact that she noted distantly as something that had happened to her without her deciding it. And then he was in the kitchen doorway with his phone in his hand, and the expression of a man who had been awake for a very long time and had just received information that confirmed something he'd already suspected. He looked at her first, not at Marcus. Her. You've seen it, he said. Yes. He came to the counter. He stood across from her with the kitchen island between them and set his phone down and said, Are you all right? The question landed strangely. She'd been asked that question before, by social workers, by people who meant it professionally rather than personally, and it had always felt like a box being checked. This felt like he actually wanted the answer and was prepared to do something with it. I'm not going to fall apart, she said. That's not what I asked. She met his eyes. No, I'm not all right. I'm also not surprised. She picked up her coffee. This is what they do. When something threatens the Foundation's image, they manage the story before anyone else can tell it. They've done it before. She paused. The social worker from 2011. The reason nothing happened after I told her wasn't just the consulting fee. They'd already been running a parallel narrative. She'd received documentation suggesting I had a history of making false allegations. By the time the investigation was over, the file said I was unstable. Adrian was very still in the way that meant he was processing rather than reacting. They documented a false history for you. They've had 24 years to build it. She said it without bitterness. Bitterness required energy she'd stopped spending on this a long time ago. There's probably a psychiatric evaluation somewhere with my name on it, maybe 2. Gregory is very thorough. Adrian picked up his phone. He typed something, sent it, set the phone down. My legal team is responding to every outlet within the hour. I need you to understand that legally, what they've published exposes them. The claim is defamatory, and they know it. They published it anyway, which means they're not using this to win legally. They're using it to create enough noise that we're managing press instead of evidence. I know. She set down her cup. They don't need it to be true. They need it to be loud. He looked at her with that complete attention of his, the one that still unsettled her in ways she hadn't fully cataloged. What do you want to do? She thought about it, about the tablet on the counter with her face on it, and the words believed to be in custody, and the specific calculation behind publishing that, the knowledge that a photograph of a young woman described as frightened, attached to the name of a man everyone already half believed was a criminal, would be shared and discussed and treated as plausible by people who would never read the retraction. I want to keep going, she said, with the investigation. I don't want to stop because they got loud. Something moved across his face, not quite approval, something quieter than that. Then we keep going. He straightened. But you need to understand that this morning changed the situation. Before this, we were working quietly. Now they know we're working. That's different. How different? Different enough that I'm adding people to the perimeter. He said it matter-of-factly. Not because you need to be afraid, because Gregory Ashcroft just told every news outlet in the country that you're here against your will, which means the next move available to him is proving it by putting you somewhere else. The words arranged themselves in her chest with a specific weight, proving it by putting you somewhere else. The clean language for a thing that wasn't clean. She'd understood from the moment she read the article what the next move was. She'd lived in Gregory Ashcroft's house long enough to understand how he thought. The particular architecture of his problem-solving, which always involved removing the problem rather than addressing it. He's going to try to take me, she said. He's going to try. Adrian's voice had something under it now. Not hot, controlled, the way the current was controlled. He won't succeed. The first attempt came that afternoon. She was in the garden, which was where she went when the walls of any space started pressing inward, a habit she'd developed in the Ashcroft house, where the garden had been the one place nobody much cared about because it didn't face the street and wasn't part of the performed respectability. Here it was different. The Dragomir Estates garden was large and unhurried, more functional than decorative, and she'd spent occasional hours in it over 8 months without anyone asking why. She was sitting on a low stone wall with her knees drawn up and the list of names from yesterday's meeting in her hand. Adrian had given her copies of everything, which was another thing she hadn't expected, the information coming toward her rather than being managed away from her. When she heard the sound, it was subtle, a shift in the quality of the afternoon that her body registered before her brain did. A tension in the periphery, the specific wrongness of something moving through a space in a way that didn't fit the space. She'd learned that sense young. It was not a comfortable thing to have learned, but it had been useful. She didn't move. She kept looking at the paper. 3 seconds. Then she heard the voice, low, male, coming from the direction of the east wall. And then Marcus materialized from the direction of the house at a pace that made very clear the garden's calm was over. It happened fast. 2 men over the east wall, moving with professional efficiency, heading in her direction, and then 3 of Adrian's people coming from angles she hadn't tracked because she hadn't known they were there. And there was a brief and brutal interval of sound and movement that lasted approximately 40 seconds before it stopped. She stayed where she was. Her hands were flat on her thighs. Her breathing was even because she'd trained it to be even in situations where it wanted to do something else. Marcus came to her. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that he wasn't acknowledging. "Inside," he said. "How many?" 2, both secured. He looked at her with the professional evaluation she was beginning to recognize, checking, not comforting. "You're not hurt." "No." She stood. Her legs were steady. She was surprised by her legs. Were they going to hurt me or take me? "Take you." He said it plainly. "Hurting you wouldn't serve the story they've already published. Taking you would." He started walking. She walked with him. "It also means they're moving faster than we expected. Gregory doesn't like waiting when he's already committed to something," she said. "Once he decides to solve a problem, he doesn't like leaving it unsolved overnight." She paused. "He would have had backup ready." Marcus glanced at her. "You know how he thinks." "I had 24 years to study him." They went inside. She sat in the kitchen again, which seemed to be where things happened now, and Marcus's cut was cleaned by someone with a medical kit, while he stood with the particular stillness of a man who considered injury a bureaucratic inconvenience. And then Adrian came in. He looked at the cut above Marcus's eye, then at Elena. Then he pulled out a chair and sat. "Tell me what you know about how he handles this kind of situation," he said. "Not the foundation. Him, personally. How he thinks when he decides to escalate." She told him. She talked for 20 minutes about Gregory Ashcroft's specific psychology, the cold patience of him, the way he categorized problems and worked through them systematically, the fact that he had never in her observation lost control of a situation because he built enough layers of contingency that control was always technically available to him. She talked about Vanessa, who was different. Where Gregory was cold and systematic, Vanessa was adaptive, social, the one who managed people while Gregory managed structures. 2 different kinds of dangerous. Adrian listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions at the end, all of them specific, all of them suggesting he'd been doing his own analysis in parallel and was checking it against hers. They aligned more than they didn't, which was not reassuring. "The PR story buys them domestic pressure," he said. "The attempted extraction was contingency, in case the domestic pressure wasn't enough. That means they're running parallel tracks, which means there's probably a 3rd one we haven't seen yet." "The legal one," Elena said. He looked at her. "They have a federal connection." She'd been thinking about this since the morning. The social worker in 2011 was local, but the foundation operates nationally. If they've been managing their exposure this long, they have someone federal, someone who can make our evidence into a liability rather than a case. Adrian was quiet. He picked up his phone. He put it down without dialing. He looked at her in a way that told her she'd said something he already knew and had been deciding whether to tell her. "What?" she said. "There's a federal investigator who contacted my legal team this morning, before the article published." He said it slowly, like he was measuring each word. He presented himself as sympathetic, said he'd been watching the Foundation for 2 years, that our evidence lines up with an existing investigation that he wants to coordinate. And the timing bothers me. She thought about it. He contacted you before the article, at 5:52 a.m., article published at 6:47. He met her eyes. Either he was monitoring them and saw the article coming and moved first, which is possible, or he was told to contact us before the article published, to get ahead of us, which is also possible. The kitchen was very quiet. The cut above Marcus's eye had stopped bleeding. Outside, somewhere on the estate, 2 men who had come over the east wall were in a situation that was being handled. And somewhere 3 miles away, Vanessa Ashcroft was in the back of a black car making phone calls. And somewhere further than that, Gregory was sitting in whatever room he sat in when he was managing a problem and working through his contingencies. "You don't trust him," Elena said. "I don't trust timing like that. But if he's real, if he actually has an existing investigation, then we need him." "I know. So you have to meet with him." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm not deciding alone. This involves your evidence as much as mine. Probably more." The phrase landed somewhere in the region of her sternum. Not painfully, almost the opposite. The specific sensation of being asked rather than managed. She was still unused to it. She suspected she would be unused to it for a while. "Meet with him," she said, "but don't give him anything real yet. See what he already knows before you show him what we have." Adrian almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. More a shift at the corner of his mouth, slight enough that she could have imagined it. "That's what I was planning." "Then why are you asking me?" "Because it's your call, too." He said it simply. "Stop acting like it isn't." The meeting with the federal investigator was set for the following morning. His name was Harlan Webb, mid-50s, career federal, the kind of resume that read clean and long and slightly too positioned, the sort of career that was either genuinely good or very carefully managed. He arrived at a neutral location, a conference room in a building that Adrian's legal team used for exactly this kind of conversation. Neutral ground, no recording obligations, the kind of space that implied professionalism while delivering nothing in particular to either side. Elena wasn't in the room. She was in a room 2 floors up, listening. That had been her idea. Adrian had explained the arrangement to Webb as a security precaution. No additional parties in the room. And Webb had accepted it with the professional lack of reaction of a man who had done many of these meetings. What Webb didn't know was that Elena was listening through a setup Marcus had arranged, and what Adrian didn't know, until she told him afterward, was that she recognized the name. She recognized it because Gregory had used it, not in conversation with her. Gregory did not have conversations with her in any meaningful sense. But 3 years ago, there had been a phone call she'd overheard from the hallway outside his study, the kind of overheard conversation that you processed in the moment as ambient and only assembled into meaning later. And the name Webb had appeared in it twice. Once in the context of Webb will handle the federal end. Once in the context of Webb understands what's at stake. She hadn't known what it meant then. She knew what it meant now. She sat in the room 2 floors up with her hands very still in her lap and listened to Harlan Webb tell Adrian Dragomir, in the measured tones of a career federal employee who had probably given this specific speech before, about the Foundation's 2-year-old investigation, the evidence they'd assembled, the very convenient way in which this evidence happened to align with Adrian's own interests in a manner that made cooperation feel not just logical, but urgent. He was good. She had to give him that. He sounded like a man telling the truth. He sounded like a man who wanted the same outcome they wanted. He was very careful never to ask directly for anything specific. The ask was always implied, always framed as mutual benefit, always dressed in the language of justice and procedure. When the meeting ended and Adrian came upstairs, she told him. She watched his face as she talked. The controlled stillness again, but this time with something running underneath it that was different from the night in the study, less cold and more like the very beginning of something hot being kept below the surface. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain I heard his name in that call." She met his eyes. "I'm certain of the context." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he's not investigating the foundation. He's protecting it. He's in the room to find out how much we have. She said it steadily. If we'd shown him the financial documents this morning, we would have handed them a map of everything we know. They'd have had it by afternoon. Adrian stood up. He walked to the window, the same motion as the study, the same quality of contained force, and stood with his back to her for a moment. When he turned around, his face was controlled, but the thing underneath it was visible in a way she hadn't seen before. I've done business through a company called Meridian Capital, he said. Legitimate business. 3 transactions 2 years ago, before I had any reason to look closely at who was underneath the holding structure. He paused. Meridian is one of Blackwell's companies. She didn't know the name yet. Blackwell, Victor Blackwell, financial architect. He runs the offshore structure that cleans the foundation's money. His jaw moved. The transactions were clean on my end. I have documentation, but documentation can be reframed. If Webb is working for them and they know I've been looking at their finances, they have everything they need to make me look like a partner rather than an investigator. The room was very still. They're not just trying to get me back, Elena said slowly. They're building a case that frames both of us. Yes. The story this morning wasn't just about controlling the narrative. It was the first layer. She was thinking out loud now, arranging the architecture of it as she spoke. Vulnerable girl in criminal's custody. Then, criminal turns out to have financial connections to the foundation. Then, the girl's testimony is compromised because she's been with him. She stopped. They're going to say I've been manipulated or coerced, that anything I say is his version, not mine. Adrian looked at her. That's what I think. Then we can't do this the way we've been doing it. She stood up. Her hands were steady. The locked room inside her chest was locked and would stay locked, but everything else in her was running clear and cold and precise. We can't build quietly and move when we're ready, because they're going to keep moving, and every day we wait is another layer they add to the frame. What are you suggesting? She thought about it, about Gregory's psychology, the systematic, layered, controlled approach, about the things she'd understood from living inside that approach for 24 years, the weakness in it. It was built for situations where the other party was reactive, where you set the terms and the other person responded to them. What happened if nobody responded? We give Webb something, she said, not real, but specific enough to look real. And we do it in a setting where, when the frame becomes visible, it's visible to someone who isn't him. She met Adrian's eyes. We walk into the trap, on purpose, with something that makes them show their hand. Adrian was very quiet. You're describing using yourself as bait, he said. I'm describing using both of us. She held his gaze. They've already published the story. They've already tried to take me. They already know about the investigation. We've lost the quiet option. She paused. The only move left is to be louder than they are. He looked at her for a long time, the complete attention, the surgical quality of it. And she looked back and didn't drop her eyes. And something passed between them in the silence that was not quite an agreement and not quite something else, and didn't have a clean name in any language she knew. I need to make some calls, he said finally. I know. This goes wrong. There's no walking it back. I know that too. He nodded. Once. The kind of nod that meant the decision was made and the conversation was over, and whatever was on the other side of the decision was now the only direction available. He picked up his phone. Elena sat back down. She looked at her bandaged hand. The cut underneath was healing. She could feel it, the specific itch of new skin forming over damage, the body doing what it always did, closing over the wound whether you asked it to or not. From downstairs she heard Adrian's voice begin, low, clipped, the voice he used when he was issuing instructions rather than having conversations. And she sat with the particular stillness of someone who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting to find out whether there was ground below. Somewhere across the city, Gregory Ashcroft was in his room moving his contingencies like pieces on a board, certain that he controlled the terms of the problem. He didn't know yet that the problem had decided to stop deciding to be decided for. The plan had 3 parts and 2 days to work. Adrian explained it to Elena in the kitchen that evening with Marcus present and 2 of the other men whose names she'd learned by now. Dolan and Reeves, both of whom had the specific economy of movement that came from years of doing work that required not being noticed. The plan was not complicated in its architecture. It was complicated in its execution, specifically because the margin for error was zero and the cost of error was everything. Part 1. Adrian would contact Webb and request a second meeting. He would indicate carefully that he'd been reconsidering the level of cooperation, that he had financial documentation he was prepared to share, documentation connecting the Foundation's offshore structure to specific transactions. He would name Meridian Capital. He would do this in a way that sounded like a man deciding to trust, which was the most dangerous kind of lie because it required the liar to be genuinely convincing rather than simply accurate. Part 2. The documentation he brought to the meeting would be real in format and false in content, real enough to look authentic to someone who wasn't a financial forensics expert, false enough that if Webb passed it to Blackwell or the Ashcrofts, the falseness would be traceable. Specific constructed errors, planted markers, the kind of thing that became a chain of evidence pointing back to whoever had handled the documents after they left Adrian's hand. Part 3 was Elena. Part 3 was the one that nobody in the room was entirely comfortable with, including Elena, but which everyone in the room understood was the load-bearing part of the structure. While Webb was in the second meeting with Adrian, Elena would be giving a formal statement to a different federal agent, a woman named Carla Moss, whom Adrian's legal team had identified through a process Elena didn't entirely understand, but which involved several phone calls and a background check that took 4 hours. Moss was not connected to Webb. She was not connected to Blackwell. She was, by every available measure, the kind of federal employee who had spent 20 years doing the work because she believed in it, which made her either genuinely trustworthy or the most sophisticated plant in the history of the operation, and they were betting on genuinely trustworthy because the alternative was a level of paranoia that made action impossible. Elena would give Moss everything. The real testimony. All of it, including the parts from the locked room, because the plan required the statement to be so complete and so specific that it became structurally independent, evidence that existed in the federal record regardless of what happened to the people who created it. Marcus had looked at Elena when Adrian laid out Part 3 and said, flatly, "She doesn't have to." "I know," Adrian had said. They'd both looked at her. "I know," she'd said. "I'll do it." She'd said it with her voice steady and her hands in her lap and the locked room locked. She'd said it because it was the correct thing, and because she understood the architecture of the plan, and because there was no version of the future she wanted that didn't go through this. She'd said it and meant it, and had spent the subsequent hours trying not to think too carefully about what it actually meant. The opening of the locked room, the delivery of its contents to a stranger in a formal setting where everything became permanent record. She'd done that before. At 11. She knew what it cost. She was going to do it anyway. The night before the meeting, she couldn't stay in her room. She went to the kitchen. The kitchen again? Always the kitchen, the room that had become the center of gravity for everything happening in this house. And she made tea she didn't want and stood at the counter in the dark and let her mind run through everything she was going to say to Carla Moss in the morning. She heard him before she saw him, the specific weight of his footsteps in the corridor. Adrian came into the kitchen and saw her and didn't say anything for a moment. He was in different clothes than earlier. Informal, the kind of clothes that said the workday was over, except that for him it was clearly not over. The kind of clothes that were just the workday in a different costume. He looked at her standing in the dark with a mug and the overhead light off and said, "Can't sleep." No. He went to the counter. He didn't make anything. He just stood on the other side of the kitchen island with his arms folded and looked at the counter in the way he looked at things when he was thinking rather than seeing. "Tomorrow goes well," he said. "Moss gets the statement. Webb walks into the frame and we see what he does with the documents. By end of day, we have either a chain of evidence pointing back to the Foundation, or we have confirmation that Webb is dirty, which is its own kind of evidence." "I know," she said. "I'm not explaining it to reassure you." "I know that too." He looked up. "Then what do you need?" The question landed differently than it usually did. Stripped of the professional context, in the dark kitchen, 2 a.m, just the question itself. What do you need? As though the answer mattered independent of whether it was useful to the plan. She thought about it, honestly. "I need to know that when this is over," she said slowly, "there's something on the other side of it, Not just the foundation collapsed and the case closed. Something that's... She stopped. I've been surviving for 24 years. I know how to survive. I don't know how to... Another stop. I don't know what comes after surviving. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Neither do I, he said, for what it's worth. She looked at him. That had not been what she expected him to say. I built this, he gestured, a small economical motion that encompassed the estate, the organization, everything. One piece at a time because it was the only thing I knew how to do. And it works. It functions. And it is, he paused, not the same as knowing what comes after. He held her gaze. But I think it's learnable. I think people figure it out. She looked at her mug. That's not a very reassuring answer. No. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. But it's an honest one. She almost smiled. Almost. Get some sleep, he said. A few hours at least. She did. She was surprised to find that she actually did. The meeting with Carla Moss was at 9. The location was a federal building downtown, not a field office, a conference room in the administrative section, the kind of space that was aggressively neutral, designed to be nobody's territory. Moss was already there when Elena arrived with Adrian's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Cho, who had the careful precision of someone who had spent 30 years translating between the languages of law and ordinary human experience. Moss was in her late 40s. Short hair, practical suit, a face that had the quality Elena associated with people who had learned to listen rather than perform listening. She stood when Elena came in and shook her hand and said, "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." Elena sat down. "Let's just start," she said. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She opened the locked room. She did it methodically, starting from the beginning, in the chronological order that a formal statement required. Not the order her memory held it, which was associative and jumbled and tied to physical sensation and smell in ways that weren't useful here, but the linear version, year by year, incident by incident, each one delivered in the flat, precise language she'd taught herself for exactly this kind of excavation. Moss asked questions. They were good questions, specific, non-leading, the questions of someone who was building a record rather than confirming what she already believed. Patricia Cho occasionally intervened on language or scope. Elena answered everything that was within scope, and flagged what wasn't, and kept her voice even, and her hands still, and the locked room open because closing it now would mean it was still in there, and she was done with things living in there. Twice she had to stop. Not because she was breaking down. She didn't break down. She had made a private agreement with herself not to break down in this room because the statement needed to be received as testimony rather than emotion. And emotion, however legitimate, gave people reasons to categorize rather than hear. She stopped because the words stopped, because there were two specific things in the room that did not have clean language, that existed in the space where language ran out, and she had to wait at the edge of them for a moment before she could find any way across. Moss waited both times without filling the silence. That mattered more than Elena expected it to. At the end, Moss closed her folder and looked at Elena for a moment. Not professionally, just directly, one person to another, and said, "I want to be honest with you. What you've just given me is significant. It's also going to take time to process and verify, which means it doesn't help you today." "I know," Elena said. "I'm also going to tell you that I've been aware of the Ashcroft Foundation for 18 months. Not at the level of what you've described, but at the level of financial anomalies that suggested something underneath the surface." Moss paused. "Your statement fills in 18 months of gaps." Elena nodded. "There's a complication." Moss's voice changed slightly. Not in tone, in weight. "There's an investigator named Webb who has been attached to adjacent federal inquiries. He's been copied on some of the preliminary work around the foundation." Another pause. "I became aware 2 days ago that he contacted your," she chose the word carefully, "associate, Adrian Dragomir." Elena stilled. "I need to tell you," Moss said, "that Harlan Webb does not have my confidence. I want to be careful about what I say in a formal context, but informally," she met Elena's eyes, "if you are sharing evidence with Harlan Webb, stop." The room was very cold. Patricia Cho had gone very still beside Elena. He contacted Dragomir yesterday morning, Elena said carefully. Before the story published. Moss looked at her. I know. We suspected he might be connected to the Foundation. He is. Moss said it flatly. I can't document it yet, but I've been watching him for 6 weeks, and the pattern is clear enough that I'm telling you directly, rather than waiting for the documentation. She leaned forward slightly. What I need to know is whether Dragomir showed him anything real in yesterday's meeting. No, Elena said. He showed him prepared documents, false content, traceable markers. Something moved across Moss's face. Relief, or its professional equivalent. Good. Because if Webb has already passed information to Blackwell's people, the real documents need to not exist yet in any form he can access. She paused. They will know by now that the documents were false. They will know that they walked into a test. And when people like Blackwell discover they've been tested, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They move on the evidence, Elena said. Whatever evidence exists that they haven't controlled. The financial records in my preliminary file are stored in the Federal Evidence Archive on the 4th floor of the building on Carver Street. Moss closed her folder. I need to tell you that as of this morning, a transfer request has been filed to move those files to a different facility for consolidation. I have filed a counter request. I don't yet know which request will be honored. She looked at Elena. I'm telling you this because you should know the shape of the risk. The shape of the risk was clearer 20 minutes later when Adrian's lawyer got the call. Elena was still in the conference room. Patricia Cho stepped out to take it and came back with her face arranged in the careful neutral of someone who was managing information before delivering it. And she said, The second meeting with Webb. Elena looked at her. It's over. Adrian is fine. She said it quickly, the way you said the important part first. But Webb brought additional people. There was she paused, a legal maneuver, mid-meeting. Webb presented documents claiming that Adrian's transactions through Meridian Capital constitute knowing participation in money laundering. He had a federal warrant. The conference room was very quiet. He's been detained, Patricia Cho said. Not arrested, detained for questioning. It's procedurally thin and we can challenge it, but it will take... She checked her phone. My estimate is 6 hours minimum before he walks out of there. 6 hours. Elena sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Moss was watching her. The archive on Carver Street, Moss said. It wasn't a question. If Webb knows the documents were false, he knows we have real documents somewhere, Elena said. And if he's detained Adrian to create a window... The transfer request, Moss said. She was already reaching for her phone. The consolidation transfer, if that goes through while I'm... She dialed. She listened. Her face changed. It's been approved, she said. The transfer starts in 3 hours. 3 hours. Elena stood up, her chair scraped back. Who approves a transfer like that? Someone with authority over the archive facility. Moss was still on the phone, talking to someone in rapid clip sentences. Someone inside. She covered the phone. I need to get to my office. I need to... How long does the transfer take to complete? Elena cut across her. Once they start moving boxes, 2 hours maybe. Maybe less if they have a full team. Moss was moving. If the files leave that building before I can get a hold order in front of a judge. 3 hours to start plus 2 hours to complete, Elena said. She was calculating. The Carver Street building was 20 minutes away. The counter request process took time, required paperwork, required Moss to physically be in front of someone with authority while also managing the Webb situation. It was too much for one person in 3 hours. That was the design of it. Webb detained Adrian to create the window. The transfer request had already been approved by whoever was inside. The documents would be gone before anyone could stop it through legitimate channels. I can get there, Elena said. Moss stopped moving. She looked at Elena. Not to take anything. Not to touch anything. Elena met her eyes. To be a witness. To document the transfer in progress. To record who is present. To... She stopped. She was thinking faster than she was talking, and it wasn't working. They need those files to disappear quietly. If someone is there who can testify to what happened to them, who moved them, under whose authorization, you are not a federal employee, Moss said. Anything you... I'm the primary witness in a trafficking case that is currently stored in that archive. Elena's voice was very steady. I have standing to be present at a proceeding affecting my own case. Patricia... She looked at Adrian's lawyer. Do I? Patricia Cho thought for approximately 2 seconds. It's arguable. It's very arguable. I need a yes or a no. Arguable means I can make the argument. Patricia looked at Moss. If your hold order comes through while Elena is present, her witness testimony about what was in process supports the hold. Moss looked at Elena. The look was long and complicated and contained, Elena thought, the specific calculation of a person who had spent 20 years inside a system weighing what the system could do against what needed to be done. I cannot tell you to go there, Moss said. I know. I cannot protect you if you're there without authorization. I know that too. Moss's jaw tightened. The building at Carver Street has a public records office on the ground floor. Anyone can enter the public areas during business hours. She said it to the middle distance, not to Elena. The archive is on the 4th floor. The stairwell access requires a key card, but the elevator is available to any visitor who has checked in at the public records desk and has a documented reason to be in the building. She said it to the middle distance. Then she went back to her phone. Elena looked at Patricia Cho. I can document your standing as a material witness, Patricia said quietly. She was already typing on her own phone. It takes me 8 minutes. You need to be in a car. Elena walked out of the conference room. Her hands were not shaking. The locked room was locked again. Sealed, stored, done for today. And everything else in her was running clear and cold and focused on the single point of a building 20 minutes away, where the evidence of everything that had been done to her was in the process of being made to disappear. Marcus was in the hallway outside. He'd been outside the whole time. He looked at her face and said, Where? Carver Street, 4th floor archive. They're moving the files. She was already walking. I need to be there before the transfer completes. He fell into step beside her without asking another question, which was the thing she was most grateful for in that specific moment, because she was using every available piece of herself to keep moving forward, and there was nothing left for explaining. The elevator at Carver Street, Moss had said, available to any visitor with a documented reason. Elena had 24 years of documented reason. She pushed through the building's front door into the gray afternoon and walked toward the car and did not let herself think about what was on the 4th floor of a federal building, or what she was going to find when she got there, or the specific quality of alone she was going to be in that archive, with the evidence of her own life being carried out in boxes by people who had been paid to make it disappear. The car moved fast through downtown traffic, and Elena sat in the back seat with her hands flat on her thighs and counted her breathing the way she'd learned to count it when she was 12 years old, and Gregory had started the specific kind of lesson that required her to stay very still and make no sound. And the only thing she could control was the air going in and out of her lungs. In, 4 counts. Out, 4 counts. The city moved past the windows in the gray afternoon light, ordinary people on ordinary sidewalks doing ordinary things. And she looked at none of it. She looked at her hands. The bandage on her right palm was starting to peel at one corner. She pressed it back down. Patricia Cho was in the front seat making calls. She'd been making calls since they left the federal building, and her voice had the clipped efficiency of someone running a legal argument in real time, constructing the framework of Elena's standing as a material witness fast enough that it could be documented before they arrived. Elena could hear the shape of it, statute references, procedural language, the specific vocabulary of someone building a structure out of words that had to hold weight. Marcus was driving. He drove the way he did everything, with the economy of someone who had stripped their actions down to what was necessary and nothing else. 4 minutes, he said. Elena nodded. When we're inside, he said, you stay in front of me. You don't go through a door before I clear it. Anything moves wrong, you listen to me immediately. No delay. Understood. I mean it. No delay. I said understood. She met his eyes in the rearview mirror. He looked at her for a moment, reading whatever was in her face, and then he looked back at the road. Patricia lowered her phone. I have documentation of your material witness standing time-stamped 4 minutes ago. It's thin, but it's real. If anyone challenges your presence in that building, you present your name and say your attorney has filed a material witness notification with the clerk of court. Don't elaborate. Don't explain. Just those words. Just those words, Elena repeated. And if someone physically tries to remove you from the archive before Moss's hold order comes through, Patricia paused. Cooperate. Don't fight it. Your value is as a witness, not as a physical presence. If you're removed, you've still documented what you saw up to that point, and I can work with that. Elena thought about the boxes, about the specific weight of what was in them. Years of financial records, the architecture of what had been done to her and others, the documentary evidence that made the difference between testimony and proof, about what it meant for those boxes to leave that building. How long for the hold order, she said. Moss is in front of a judge right now, or she's about to be. If the judge grants it immediately, 20 minutes. If there's any complication, Patricia didn't finish that sentence. 20 minutes, or more. The car stopped. Carver Street. The federal building was gray concrete and glass, unassuming in the way federal buildings were unassuming, designed to look administrative rather than powerful, though the power was in the basement and on the fourth floor, and in the people who moved through it like they owned the definitions of things. Go, Marcus said. The public records desk was staffed by a woman in her 50s, who looked at Elena and Marcus with the professional neutrality of someone who processed visitors all day and had long ago stopped categorizing them. Elena gave her name, said she was a material witness in an active federal case, said she needed access to the archive floor in connection with a transfer currently in process affecting her case. The woman typed, looked at her screen, typed again. Elena stood with her hands at her sides and her breathing counted, and her face arranged in the expression she'd learned for situations that required her to look more certain than she felt, which was the expression of someone who had already decided and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Fourth floor, the woman said. Sign here. She signed. She took the visitor badge. She clipped it to her collar and walked to the elevator with Marcus one step behind her, and she did not look back at the desk, and she did not look at her reflection in the elevator doors when they opened because she did not want to see what her face was doing. The elevator went up, 4 floors. The doors opened onto a corridor that smelled like recycled air and old paper, and the particular antiseptic quality of spaces where things were stored rather than used. Down the corridor to the left was a door marked Archive, Authorized Personnel, and beside it a security panel, and beside that a window that looked into the archive proper. Through the window, boxes, stacked on a rolling cart, a man in a gray uniform reading something off a clipboard. Another man, not in uniform, standing near the far wall with his arms crossed, and the look of someone supervising rather than working. The man near the wall was not anyone Elena had seen before. He was in his 40s, unremarkable in the specific way of people who cultivated unremarkability professionally, and he was watching the man with the clipboard with the focused attention of someone making sure a job got done correctly. Elena looked at the boxes on the cart. She counted them. 8. Labeled in the particular government format, case numbers, dates, the alphanumeric identifiers that turned human disaster into administrative categories. She recognized the case number prefix on 3 of them because Moss had said it in the conference room, and Elena had the kind of memory that held numbers against her will. Her files, or rather, the files that described her files, the preliminary financial records, the 18 months of Moss's work that provided the evidentiary scaffolding that would make her testimony something other than one person's word. The door's key-carded, Marcus said quietly beside her. I know. I can't get through it without... I know. She turned from the window. Down the corridor, the other direction was another door, also key-carded, but through its window she could see what appeared to be a secondary access point into the archive, a connecting room, and through that connecting room... Elena! I see it. You don't have a key card. No. She looked at the security panel beside the archive door, at the small camera mounted above it, at the visitor badge on her collar with her name on it and the timestamp of her entry downstairs. But I have documentation that I'm here, which means whatever happens while I'm here is on record. She looked at Marcus. I need you to stay in this corridor, right here, in front of this window, visible, on camera. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you doing? Creating a witness. She held his gaze. You're going to stand where that camera can see you and where anyone coming off the elevator will see you. And I'm going to go down the corridor and see if that connecting door has the same keycard system or a different one. If it's the same, you can't get through? Then I'll come back and stand next to you, and we'll both be witnesses and hope Moss's order comes in time. She paused. But if it's a different system, Elena. His voice had the quality it had when he was about to override her. If you go through a door you're not authorized to go through, I'm a material witness to an active federal case, she said. And the evidence in those boxes is currently being transferred under a request filed by someone who is demonstrably connected to the subject of that case. The worst thing that happens if I go through that door is I get removed, and it's documented that I was removed while trying to prevent unauthorized destruction of evidence. She held his eyes. The worst thing that happens if I don't go through that door is those boxes leave the building. Marcus looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not capitulation, more like recognition. The specific look of someone who has just identified something they've been looking at for a while without seeing it clearly. 30 seconds in that connecting corridor, he said. If the door doesn't open in 30 seconds, you come back. She was already moving. Shut. The connecting door had a standard push-bar handle and no keycard panel. It opened. The room behind it was a narrow space, utility corridor, the kind that existed between the public-facing architecture of a building and its working guts, lined with shelving units holding older boxes, overflow from the main archive. One fluorescent light humming, bare concrete floor. At the far end, another door, and through the small reinforced window in that door, she could see the main archive floor. She could see the rolling cart, the man with the clipboard, closer now, and the man near the wall, and he had turned slightly, and she could see his face in profile. She pushed through the second door. The sound of the archive was different from the corridor, more contained, the sound of a space that absorbed things. The man with the clipboard looked up. His expression went from neutral to uncertain in the span of a second. The expression of someone whose mental map of who was authorized to be in this space had just received information that didn't fit. This area is restricted, he said. Not hostile, processing. I'm Elena Ashcroft. She kept her voice level, held up her visitor badge. I'm a material witness in an active federal case. Case numbers 4471-B through 4471-G are material to my case. I'm here to document this transfer. The man near the wall had turned fully now. He looked at her with eyes that didn't process things slowly. His gaze went to her badge, to her face, to the door she'd come through, to the corridor beyond, and back to her. And the whole assessment took about 2 seconds, and at the end of it, his expression was not uncertain at all. There's no authorization for a witness presence during an archive transfer, he said. His voice was smooth, administrative. My material witness notification was filed at, she checked her phone, 2:43 p.m. today with the clerk of court. My attorney can provide documentation. This is a restricted area. Still smooth. I need you to return to the public corridor. I'll return to the public corridor when the hold order currently being processed by federal judge. She didn't know the judge's name. Moss hadn't said the judge's name, and she felt the gap open up under her and kept her voice even anyway. When the hold order currently in process has been adjudicated. Until that point, I'm exercising my right as a material witness to document proceedings affecting my case. The man looked at her. She looked back. He reached into his jacket pocket. His hand came out with a phone. He dialed without taking his eyes off her. She stood where she was. Her heart was doing something complicated, not the counted rhythm she'd trained, something faster and less managed, the actual animal response to being in a closed room with a person whose hands she couldn't fully see. But her face was still, and her voice had been steady, and she was not moving. He said 3 words into the phone that she didn't catch. Then he listened. His expression didn't change. Then he said, "She's here." Listened again, said, "Understood. Put the phone away." "You need to step away from the boxes," he said. "I'm not touching the boxes." "Step away from them." She moved 2 steps to the side. Not back. Sideways, which put her between the boxes and the door she'd come through. She wasn't touching anything. She was standing in a space where she was legally documentable as a witness. She was looking at the man with the clipboard, who had stopped moving entirely, and at the man near the wall who was watching her with the specific stillness of a person calculating variables. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it without lowering her hands. A text from Patricia Cho, 4 words. "Judge is reviewing now." Reviewing. Not granted. Not yet. The man near the wall stepped toward her. I'm going to need to escort you out, he said. The smoothness was still there, but it had an edge under it now. The edge of someone who had been given an instruction and was deciding how to carry it out. You can document that you escorted a material witness out of an archive during a contested evidence transfer, Elena said. I'd recommend thinking carefully about whether you want that on record. He stopped. 3 feet from her. The fluorescent light hummed above them. The boxes on the rolling cart sat where they sat, labeled with case numbers, holding inside them the financial scaffolding of 30 years of what had been done to people who didn't have anyone to look at their hands and ask, who did this? I'm not leaving, Elena said. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. Not shaking, just quiet and entirely real. You can pick me up and carry me out of here, and it will be on the building's cameras, and it will be in the clerk's record, and my attorney will file within the hour. Or you can wait 20 minutes for the hold order to come through and do this correctly. She met his eyes. But I'm not leaving. The man looked at her for a long time. Then his phone rang. He answered it. His face changed. Not dramatically, not the way faces changed in films, but in the small, specific way of someone receiving information that altered the calculation they'd been running. His jaw tightened. He said 2 words. How many? Listened. Said, when? Listened again. The smoothness in his expression had developed a crack in it, thin but real. He lowered the phone. He looked at the man with the clipboard. He said, hold the transfer. The man with the clipboard looked confused. Sir, the authorization was, hold it. Sharper now. The smoothness gone. Elena's phone buzzed again. Patricia. Hold order granted, serving now. She felt it move through her. It's not relief exactly. Something more structural, the sensation of a weight she hadn't been aware of carrying shifting slightly, redistributing. Not gone. Not yet. But different. The door to the main corridor opened, and Marcus came through it, and behind Marcus was a woman Elena didn't recognize in a federal jacket, and behind her 2 more, and the man near the wall looked at them with the expression of someone watching a plan that had been running smoothly for 30 years develop a problem it hadn't accounted for. The woman in the federal jacket said, nobody touches these boxes. The next 4 hours were procedural in the way that the worst things often were. A series of rooms and conversations and forms, the machinery of official process grinding through what had happened, and Elena moved through all of it with Marcus 1 step behind her and Patricia Cho's voice in her ear managing the legal architecture of each stage. Adrian was released at 4:17 p.m. The warrant Webb had used was challenged and found procedurally deficient within 3 hours of being filed, which Patricia said was faster than expected and suggested either extraordinary legal work or that the warrant had been constructed hastily enough to fall apart under scrutiny. Probably both. Elena was in a conference room when he arrived. He came through the door and looked at her. Just looked. The complete attention, the surgical quality. And she looked back, and then he sat down across from her without touching her, without making it something it didn't need to be. Just sat down. You went to the archive, he said. Yes. Alone. Marcus was in the corridor. He looked at Marcus, who was standing near the wall. Marcus looked back with the expression of a man who had already made peace with whatever questions were coming. Adrian looked back at Elena. The hold order came through. Yes? The transfer was stopped. Yes. You stood between a man working for Blackwell and 8 boxes of federal evidence. He said it evenly. For approximately 11 minutes before the hold order served. Approximately. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the conference room, somewhere in the building, things were being processed, forms filed, boxes secured, the formal mechanisms of the legal system doing what they did when someone had managed to survive long enough to make them move. You were supposed to be the documentation, he said, not the obstruction. The documentation required someone to be present. She met his eyes. You were detained. Moss was in front of a judge. The boxes were on a cart. She paused. I was the only person in a position to be there. You could have been physically removed. I was prepared for that. You could have been... He stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, the muscle in his jaw working. When he looked back up, his expression had something in it that she hadn't seen on his face before, Not anger, not at her, something more internal than that. Something that looked like what fear looked like on a person who had trained themselves not to feel it. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you're all right. You're sitting in front of me." He said it with a controlled precision that was doing a lot of work. "That doesn't mean I have to enjoy the part where you stood in a federal archive alone." The conference room was quiet. Patricia was in the corridor. Marcus was looking at the wall with the focused interest of a man determined to be somewhere else in his mind. Elena looked at Adrian's face, at the controlled precision of it, and underneath that, the thing it was controlling. She thought about the kitchen at 2 a.m. Neither do I, the honesty of that. She thought about a man who built an organization one piece at a time because it was all he knew how to do, and called it not the same as knowing what came after. "They still have Webb," she said, "and whatever he's told them about the investigation structure. They know we have real documents now. They know the hold order went through. They know the transfer failed." She paused. "Gregory isn't done." "No." Adrian straightened, the controlled precision back in full, the working face. "But neither are we." He looked at the file Patricia had left on the table. "Moss's hold covers the preliminary evidence. We have the financial records from my people, the trace documents from Webb, and your testimony on record." He tapped the folder. "It's enough to move. Not enough to guarantee, but enough to move." The raids. Moss is coordinating. She needs one more piece. The direct connection between Webb and Blackwell, which we have in the trace documents because Webb passed them within 4 hours of the meeting, which means whoever he passed them to received documents with our markers in them. He paused. "By tomorrow morning, we'll know exactly how far the chain goes." By tomorrow morning, Elena sat with that, with the specific weight of tomorrow morning as a concept, the thing on the other side of today, after the archive and the hold order, and the 11 minutes in Adrian's face when he came through the door. "The Ashcrofts," she said. "Warrants are being prepared." Blackwell. "Moss has a federal team on his location. He won't move without us knowing." She nodded. She looked at her hands on the table. The bandage almost fully peeled away now, the skin underneath pink and new, the cut closed. "I want to be in the courtroom," she said. "When the charges are read, I want to be there." Adrian looked at her. "That can be arranged." "Not as a victim, not as a witness." She met his eyes. "As someone who was present for all of it." He held her gaze. "All right." She nodded again. She looked at the folder on the table. Through the conference room window, she could see the corridor where people were moving with the purposeful urgency of things finally in motion, the formal machinery engaged at last, slow and imperfect and real. Her phone buzzed. "Moss. Webb is talking. He wants a deal. We have the chain." She showed it to Adrian. He read it. Something moved across his face, the corner of his mouth, the slight shift, and he set the phone on the table and said nothing. He didn't have to. Tomorrow morning, the warrants would execute. Tomorrow, the raids would move. Tomorrow, Gregory Ashcroft would be in a room where the walls didn't accommodate the version of reality he'd spent 30 years building. And Vanessa would be in a room like that too. And Blackwell would be in transit from an airport he hadn't managed to reach in time, and the case numbers on 8 boxes of federal evidence would start meaning something other than administrative categories. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, in a conference room in a federal building, Elena Ashcroft sat across from the man who had crouched down on a marble floor and looked at her hands. And through the window, people were moving with urgency. And somewhere in the building, her testimony was in the permanent record in a file that could not be transferred or consolidated or made to disappear. And the locked room in her chest was still locked, but the key was in her hand now, and she was the one who decided when the door opened. The warrants executed at 6:14 in the morning. Elena knew the precise time because she was awake when it happened. Had been awake since 4, sitting in the kitchen of the Dragomir estate with cold coffee and the particular stillness of someone waiting for a sound they've been listening for their entire life. When Marcus came through the door at 6:22 and said, "It's moving," she nodded once and set down her mug and felt something in her chest that was not relief and not joy and not the clean, triumphant feeling that stories promised for moments like this. It felt like the morning after a very long illness, like the fever had broken sometime in the night, and the body knew it was over but hadn't yet figured out what over meant. She asked Marcus for details. He gave them plainly, the way he gave everything. No softening, no performance of comfort, just the facts arranged in order. Federal teams at the Ashcroft residence on Meridian Drive at 6:14. Simultaneous execution at the Foundation's administrative offices downtown. Gregory Ashcroft had been at home. He had not resisted. Vanessa had been in the bedroom and had asked twice to call her attorney before being told she could do that from the federal processing facility. Blackwell had been at the airport. Not quite in time. The federal team had intercepted him at the gate for a flight to Zurich with 2 carry-on bags and a passport that had been used 8 times in the past 14 months. All exits, no returns. He had said nothing when they took his bags. He had looked at the agent who cuffed him with the expression of a man running calculations that were no longer adding up. And then he had looked at nothing. Webb had already been processed. His deal was in negotiation. The details were above Elena's clearance level, Patricia had said, which was the precise way of saying that it was happening, and she would know the shape of it eventually, but not today. Elena sat with all of this for a while. Then she went upstairs and showered and put on clean clothes and came back down and made fresh coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the estate grounds in the early morning light. Adrian came downstairs at 7. He looked like a man who had also not slept, which made 2 of them, and he came to the counter and poured coffee without speaking and stood beside her at the window for a moment. "It's done," he said. "Not done," she said. "Started." She looked at the grounds. The garden was gray-green in the early light, damp from overnight rain, ordinary. "The charges are filed. The case has to be built. The trials will take—" She paused. "A long time." "Yes. I'll have to testify again. Multiple times, probably." She looked at her coffee. "The defense will challenge everything. They have resources. They'll challenge my credibility, my history, the circumstances of my being here." She said it evenly. "I know what it's going to look like when their attorneys start." "I know." Adrian set down his cup. "You won't be doing it alone." She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was quiet, and the morning was coming through the window in the particular gray-gold way of early light. And she thought about the night he'd crouched down on the marble floor and looked at her hands, and about everything that had happened between that moment and this one, and about the specific distance between those 2 points in time, which was not large in calendar terms and was enormous in every other sense. "There's something I have to do today," she said, "before the lawyers and the case and all of it." "What?" "I need to go back to the Ashcroft house." She saw his expression change and said, "Not to see them. They're not there. I left things, personal things." She paused. "One thing." He looked at her for a moment. "Marcus will take you." "I know." She almost smiled. "I'm not asking permission." "I know you're not." This time the corner of his mouth moved. "I'm saying Marcus will take you." The Ashcroft house on Meridian Drive had federal tape across the front entrance, and a car parked outside with 2 agents who checked her name against a list and let her in through the side entrance, which was the entrance the staff used, the one she had used 400 times without thinking about the fact that there was a front door she had never been invited to use. She went in through the side. She walked through the kitchen, immaculate, Gregory's standard, not a surface out of place even now, and through the corridor to the small room at the back of the house that had been hers for the years before the estate. The room was 8 feet by 10. It had a single window that faced the garden wall. The bed was narrow and the furniture was functional, and everything in it was the specific kind of clean that came from cleaning things, because you had to, rather than because they were yours. She went to the closet. Behind the spare uniforms on the bottom shelf, underneath a folded blanket, was a box. Not large, shoebox-sized, older, the cardboard soft with age. She took it out and held it for a moment. Inside the box, a photograph of a woman she had no other image of, edges worn soft where she'd held them over years. 3 letters that had arrived when she was 7 and stopped arriving when she was 8, postmarked from cities she'd located on maps when she was old enough to find maps. A small ceramic figure, a bird, blue, one wing slightly chipped, that had been in her hand when she arrived at the Ashcroft house at age 3, and that she had kept through every subsequent year through the specific tenacity of someone who understood that some things had to be held onto or they stopped existing. These were the things that were hers. Not the uniform, not the room, not the name she carried. These. She put the lid back on the box. She stood in the room for a moment, looking at it. The narrow bed, the window facing the wall, the functional furniture. And she waited to feel something complicated about it. She felt very little. It was a room. It had held her body for years. It did not hold anything else of hers because she had never allowed anything else to be held here, had always kept the real things in the box behind the blanket, out of reach of the inventory of what could be taken. She walked out. She went through the kitchen again. She went out the side entrance. She did not look back. The arraignment was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the warrants. She sat in the third row of the public gallery with Patricia Cho on her left and Marcus on her right, and watched Gregory and Vanessa Ashcroft be walked into a courtroom. They looked like themselves. That was the thing that struck her. The ordinariness of how they looked. The same posture and the same careful presentation. Gregory in a gray suit that someone had brought to whatever facility he'd been processed through. Vanessa with her hair arranged and her expression arranged, and both of them carrying the specific bearing of people who had spent 30 years being believed by rooms. The difference was the context. The room was not believing them today. The charges were read. Elena listened to each one with the focused attention she'd learned to bring to things that required her to be present, rather than dissociated. And she heard the words, trafficking, exploitation, conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction, racketeering. And she felt them land with the weight that official language had, the weight of the system finally moving in the direction of the thing rather than away from it. Gregory looked at this gallery once. His gaze moved across the rows. The specific inventory-taking look she recognized, the categorization, and it passed over her and came back and stopped. She held his gaze. He looked away first. In 34 years of her life, that had never happened, and the smallness of it, one moment, one direction of a gaze, contained something she did not have language for yet, but which she intended to figure out eventually. Vanessa did not look at the gallery. Blackwell was processed separately. She was not in the room for that. She didn't need to be. Outside the courthouse afterward, on the steps in the thin November light, Patricia was talking to someone with a briefcase, and Marcus was standing 3 feet away doing the standing still thing, and Elena stood at the edge of the steps and looked at the city laid out below them, ordinary, continuing, doing what cities did, which was persist regardless of what happened inside their buildings. Adrian came to stand beside her. He'd been in the back of the gallery, which was where he'd stayed throughout, unobtrusive in the way that large presences sometimes manage to be by not requiring anything from the space they occupied. "How do you feel?" he said. She considered it honestly. "Like the first part is over," she said. "Not the last part." "No, not the last. The trials will be long." She looked at the city. "Gregory will make them long. It's the last thing he has. The ability to slow down what's coming." She paused. "I'll be ready. I know you will." She looked at him. He was looking at the city too, the same direction, and in the November light he looked older than the dining room and younger than the study, somewhere in between, the version of him that existed when he wasn't running the machine. "What happens to you," she said, "with the Meridian business, the framing attempt?" "Resolved," he said. "The documentation of the actual transactions is clean. Webb's testimony about the framing attempt is on record." He paused. "There will be scrutiny. There's always scrutiny." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'm accustomed to scrutiny." "You don't mind it." "I mind it less than the alternative, which is not having done any of this." He looked at her. "I don't regret the last 3 weeks, for what it's worth." She thought about the dining room and the broken glass and his voice saying, "Stop," and the study with the door closed and the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and the conference room where she'd opened the locked room, and the archive with the fluorescent light humming, and 8 boxes on a rolling cart. She thought about the photograph in the box she was holding, the edges worn soft, the woman she had no other image of. "Neither do I," she said. The months that followed were not easy. She hadn't expected them to be. The trials moved through the legal system with the grinding patience of large machinery, and she testified 3 times across 14 months, once in the primary federal case, once in a separate proceeding related to the foundation's financial operations, once in a civil case brought by a coalition of survivors whose attorneys had used her testimony as the anchor for a broader claim. Each time she sat in the witness chair, she did the same thing she'd done in the conference room with Moss, opened the locked room, delivered what was in it with precision and steadiness, closed it again afterward. Each time was different from the previous time. Not easier exactly. The content didn't become less true with repetition, but more familiar in the way that hard things became familiar, the way you learned the specific shape of a pain and stopped being surprised by it. She moved out of the estate 4 months after the arraignment. This had been her decision, made quietly and without drama. She'd told Adrian on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen, where all the significant conversations seemed to happen, and he had listened and nodded and not tried to talk her out of it. She found an apartment 20 minutes away, 3rd floor, 2 rooms, a window that faced east. She furnished it slowly, one piece at a time, choosing each thing because she wanted it rather than because it was functional and provided to her. The process of choosing, of standing in a store and deciding this and not that for no reason other than preference, was stranger and more significant than she'd expected. And she spent a long time sometimes in front of objects that were not important, learning the sensation of wanting something for herself. She started working with a woman named Dr. Renata Marsh, who had a small office with plants she talked to occasionally when she thought her patients weren't listening, and who had the specific gift of being comfortable with silence in a way that made silence feel habitable rather than threatening. Elena went to see her every week and said things she had not said in the conference room, the things that lived underneath the testimony. Not the events, but the texture of them, the way they had shaped her relationship to her own body, her own presence in a room, her own voice. It was slow. It was not linear. There were weeks that moved backward. She went anyway. The foundation's assets were frozen within the first 8 months and subsequently liquidated through the court process. A portion was awarded in damages to the documented survivors, a number that grew as the case progressed, and other people found enough safety in the existing proceedings to come forward. Elena was named as a primary complainant and coordinator by the legal team, which meant she received correspondence and attended meetings and became, incrementally, the person at the center of something rather than the person being managed at the margins of it. She built the foundation slowly. Not herself alone, she had Adrian's legal infrastructure, which he offered without conditions, and Patricia Cho, who was transitioning into nonprofit law and brought 3 colleagues, and Moss, who had retired from federal service 6 months after the case concluded and had opinions about survivor services that were useful and specific and worth hearing. The foundation was called Scarred Hands. She had named it that herself. In a meeting where everyone else was suggesting language about hope and futures and recovery, and she had said Scarred Hands, and there had been a brief silence, and then Patricia had written it down. It meant what it meant. She wasn't interested in the version that softened it. In the second year, Gregory Ashcroft was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. The jury deliberated for 9 days, which his defense team presented as a sign of reasonable doubt, and which meant, in practice, that 11 things were now permanently true in the official record of what he had done. Vanessa received a lesser sentence through a cooperation agreement she'd entered 6 months into the proceedings. Elena had not been consulted about the agreement and had not asked to be. She had her own feelings about it that she was working on with Renata Marsh, and which she kept out of the courtroom because the courtroom required a different part of her than the therapy office did. Blackwell received the longest sentence. His financial architecture had been used to process funds through 4 different states and 2 foreign jurisdictions, and the federal case against him had the particular comprehensiveness of an investigation that had had 18 months of preliminary work, followed by the complete financial record that Adrian's people had assembled. He sat through his sentencing with the expression of a man still running calculations that would never add up the way he needed them to. She was in the courtroom for each sentencing, not in the gallery. At the table with Patricia and the other attorneys, in the position she had earned by being the person who had made all of this possible and then showed up every time it required showing up. Gregory looked at her again from the defendant's table when the sentence was read. The look was different from the arraignment, not the categorizing inventory look, something older than that, something that might have been the particular face of a man confronting the fact that a problem he had spent 30 years managing had resolved in a direction he had not built his system to accommodate. She looked back. She held his gaze until he looked away, the same as before, and then she looked at the judge, because the judge was what mattered in that room, and Gregory Ashcroft was not what mattered anymore. She was in the garden behind her apartment on a Saturday in early spring. She had planted things in the small patch of ground the building allowed, growing them with the same incremental attention she'd brought to everything since the trial, learning what she liked and what she didn't, what grew and what didn't. When her phone rang. It was Renata Marsh, which was unusual on a Saturday. She answered. Renata said, "I had a cancellation this afternoon. I know it's not your regular time. I thought you might want to come in." Elena looked at the patch of dirt with its early green, the small, deliberate things she was growing. "Is there something specific?" she said. "No," Renata said. "I just thought you might want to." Elena thought about it, about the specific quality of today, the spring light, the dirt under her fingernails, the sensation of being in a space she had chosen and was tending. "Not today," she said. "I think I'm all right today." There was a brief, warm pause. "Good," Renata said. "That's good." She hung up and looked at the garden for a while, hands at her sides, in the spring light. Adrian came for dinner that evening. This had become the shape of things. Not every week, not with the daily proximity of the estate, but regularly, consistently, in the way that things were regular and consistent when they had been decided rather than fallen into. He brought food from a place she'd mentioned once, months ago, and she made coffee, and they ate at the table by the east window and talked about the foundation's upcoming intake process, and a legal question Patricia had flagged and a book she'd read that he hadn't, and he was wrong about a film she'd seen and she told him so with the specific directness she was learning to use for things that were not high stakes. The practice of saying what she thought when nothing was at risk. He took it without deflation, which she'd learned was one of the things about him that she had not expected and had come to rely on. After dinner, she washed the dishes, and he sat at the table with his coffee, and at some point the conversation found its way to silence, the way conversations did between people who had learned to be in the same room without filling it. She was putting a mug in the cabinet when it slipped. Not far. She caught it, one-handed, before it had dropped more than 6 inches, a fast reflex from the hand that had healed over the cut. The new skin firm now and completely functional, and she stood with the mug in her hand for a moment and felt her own heart. Because she had caught it. That was the first thing. Because her hands were not shaking. That was the second thing. Because there was no sound in her head of footsteps coming. No braced anticipation of what came after breakage. No calculation of cost. Just a mug, caught, in a kitchen that was hers. And the quiet behind her where a man was sitting at her table drinking coffee with no particular expression on his face. She put the mug in the cabinet. She stood with her hands on the counter for a moment. Not because she needed to, just because she wanted to feel it. The solidity of the counter, the quiet of the room, the spring evening coming through the window, everything in this kitchen belonging to her by choice rather than assignment. "Okay?" Adrian said from the table. She turned around. He was looking at her with the complete attention. The one she'd learned did not require a response of any particular kind. It was just his way of seeing, thorough and direct. And she had stopped feeling evaluated by it and started feeling simply seen. "Yes," she said. She meant it in the specific way she had learned to mean things. Not the performed certainty she'd been trained to produce, not the flat statement designed to prevent follow-up questions, but the actual assessment of her own interior, honest and present. She was all right. The mug was in the cabinet. The spring was outside the window. The scar tissue on her right palm was smooth and permanent and carried the specific truth of a wound that had closed correctly, which was not the same as a wound that had never existed but was its own kind of wholeness. "Come sit down," he said. She came and sat down. He poured more coffee into her cup without being asked, because he had learned the small things the way she had learned the small things, by paying attention to what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. And they sat in the kitchen in the spring evening, and the silence was the kind of silence she had not known was possible. The silence that didn't require anything, didn't threaten anything, just existed around two people who had come through something and arrived on the other side of it still intact. She looked at her hands on the table, the left one with the crooked index finger that had healed wrong, which would always be what it was. The right one with the smooth scar across the palm from the crystal glass on the marble floor, the beginning of all of this. The burn marks on the inside of her wrist, silvered and permanent. The dry, competent skin of someone who had used her hands her entire life and would continue to use them. They were not what she would have chosen. They were what she had. They were hers. "The foundation takes its first intake next month," she said. "I know. 14 women, 2 minors. housed separately with the youth services coordinator we brought on. She looked at the window. I'm meeting with all of them individually in the first week. Renata's team will be there. Patricia has the legal side set up. She paused. I want to be the first person they talk to. Not a coordinator, not a caseworker. Me. Why? She thought about how to say it. About the dining room and the marble floor, and a man crouching down instead of standing over her and asking not about the glass, but about the damage. About what that had cost him in practical terms, in the weeks that followed, and what it had cost her to accept it, and what had happened on the other side of both of those costs. Because I want them to talk to someone who knows what the room is, she said. The locked room. I want them to know that it can be opened without disappearing. She looked at him, and that someone will be there when it is. He looked at her for a long moment. The spring evening was going golden outside the window. Somewhere below, a car passed on the street. Ordinary life persisting. They'll be lucky, he said, to have you in the room. She held his gaze. The thing between them did not have a clean name, and she had stopped needing it to. It was what it was. Real in the specific way that things were real when they had been tested by circumstances that cared nothing for comfort. When they had survived not because they were perfect, but because they were honest. Because two people had told each other the truth in rooms with closed doors, and neither of them had used the truth as a weapon. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first thing she had ever had that was simply hers. Not owed, not managed, not contingent on her usefulness or her silence. Outside the window, the spring evening moved toward dark, and the coffee cooled slowly in their cups, and the apartment held its quiet around them like something that had been built to last. Not grand, not performed, just a kitchen and a table, and two people sitting with the weight of what they'd survived laid down for a moment, learning what it felt like to simply be still. She did not fill the silence. Neither did he. And in that ordinary moment, in a kitchen where broken things did not lead to fear, where a mug caught mid-fall was just a mug, and a scar was just a scar, and the person across the table was simply there. In that moment, without announcement or conclusion, the story found its end. Not because everything was healed, not because the past had been unmade or the records expunged or the locked room emptied and painted over, but because Elena Ashcroft, who had spent 24 years learning to disappear, was sitting at her own table in her own kitchen in the spring evening, and she was not disappearing. She was here. Fully, finally, irreversibly here. And that specific, hard-won, ordinary fact was everything.